Hi, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Nancy. So my name is Gemini Bhalsod, and I'm a horticulture educator with Illinois Extension. So my office is located in North Suburban Cook County. And today, for the Four Seasons Gardening webinar, I'm going to talk to you about planning your garden for seed saving. So the reason I chose this topic for the winter especially, and why I encourage gardeners to think about seed saving as you're planning your garden and becoming excited about the summer, is because understanding some of these key concepts like pollination and isolation will result in more high quality seeds. So rather than deciding to save seeds at the end of the growing season, as you're in your garden finding your last overripe plants on the vine, if you think about saving seeds right now, you could have a better quality plant. So why even save seeds? Why would a gardener want to go through the trouble of planting, growing, harvesting, drying, and storing their own seeds when they could buy them themselves? First, it saves a lot of money. So you can save seeds from your favorite plants or special varieties like heirloom plants. Second, it increases your self-reliance since you aren't depending on these seed companies for your plants each year. Third, it's going to preserve genetic diversity. So you can save seeds with particular qualities and traits that you might be interested in. So then you're playing your part in preserving this biodiversity of seed genetics. So also saving seeds is a part of a really long tradition, and it can help preserve cultural identity, which is very, very important, especially if you're choosing to save seeds, for example, from your grandmother's favorite heirloom tomato variety that you grew up eating with her, or saving seeds from a vegetable that's an important ingredient in your personal cultural foods that you can't always find in the grocery store. So I grew up saving seeds from vegetables that were really difficult to locate or buy in the US. So my family would find them at the stores or would order them and then save seeds year after year to continue growing those foods that were important to us culturally. Fourth, it engages you in the plant life cycle, which for me, as someone who's trained in, botany and plant biology, is really, really fun. It can be a great teaching tool also if you're gardening with kids, for example, so you can grow the plant from the seed and, end the season also with saving seeds. And lastly, if you've ever been to a seed swap, you know how energetic and passionate seed savers are about their seeds. So saving seeds is a really great way to build community, especially if you come together and share your favorites with each other. And finally, it's also a creative process that can be fun. You get to choose the most desirable traits. What is the tastiest plant that you had that season, or something that you're very excited to grow. So it can be really fun to save seeds too. So today for this webinar, I'm going to go over a few definitions, how to select plants, some isolation methods, which is going to be important as you're planning your garden, harvesting, treating, storing, and then finally, how you might regrow your favorite seeds. So first we'll get started with these definitions, and I promise it all will come together for the service of seed saving and for you to be able to figure out how to do it. So these definitions aren't meant to bog you down, but are meant to be a tool for you to have the best seeds at the end of the season. So first is the difference between pollination and fertilization. This is an important distinction. So because pollination is just the transfer of pollen from the male to the female part of a flower, whereas fertilization is that union of the male and female cells. So fertilization is actually what leads to seed and fruit formation, and that's the most important part if you're trying to get fruit and seeds from your plants. Next, we have self-pollinated versus cross-pollinated plants. So plants that are self-pollinated, these are plants that have flowers that have both male and female parts on the same flower, and the pollen transfer is going to occur within the same flower. So self-pollinated plants like roses, beans, or tomatoes, in general have less genetic diversity because they're self-pollinating themselves. Sometimes these plants have flower structures that might prevent introduction of pollen from other plants. For plants that are cross-pollinated, they have separate male and female flowers on the same plant. So they can have that, or they can have separate male and female plants. The flowers can be self-incompatible. That just means that fertilization doesn't occur because of, chemistry and various other responses. There also might be a timing difference with these flowers. So it could be when the flower opens between different varieties or the maturation of the flower parts. So cross-pollination over time leads to more genetic diversity. And cross-pollinating plants have mechanisms that actually encourage pollination by other plants of the same species. So here are some examples of cross-pollination methods. So avocados, for example, these have flowers with both male and female parts, but the parts of different varieties and different types actually open on different days. So the flower has both the male and female parts, but one day the male part will open for one variety and the next day the female part will open. So avocados are actually divided into type A and type B depending on their flower. So no self-pollination can really occur with avocados. Asparagus plants is another example. These plants are separated, so they have separate male and female plants. So it's important to note actually that the cultivated asparagus that you grow to eat will cross-pollinate with wild asparagus, sometimes making the seeds difficult, making it difficult to save seeds from. So if you do want to save seeds from asparagus, which I've worked with community gardens that have had success doing that, you do need to have the male and female plants. But often with asparagus, it's easier to just buy and plant the crowns, which is more common and what people usually do. So even though we're just talking about seed saving today, that doesn't mean that every plant that you want to grow might be the best suited for saving seeds from. So apples is another example. These have to be cross-pollinated between different varieties to set fruit. So without the different varieties, you might get lots of flowers in the spring and pretty spring blooms, but you wouldn't get any apples. So I talked about male and female flowers, and you might be asking, what does that mean, or what does that even look like? So these male flowers only have the pollen producing parts, and often female flowers have a miniature fruit on the bottom. So if you're taking a look at these photos that are on your screen, notice some of the differences. So you can see on the top of the female cucumber flower that miniature plant, the miniature fruit example, excuse me, that I mentioned that I'm talking about. Next, I need to discuss a little bit about the difference between open pollinated, heirloom, and hybrid seeds. I would say if you are already interested in seed saving, these are the most common terms that are kind of thrown around, so I wanted to define them for you today. So open pollinated plants usually produce seeds that are similar to the parent. These are also often referred to as true to type. That just means that the seed that you're going to grow is going to look similar and be similar to the parent that it grew from. So because pollen exchange, they're open pollinated, it's not really a restriction. These plants have more genetic diversity. They're pollinated by insects, birds, or wind, and they're usually pretty good for seed saving. An heirloom plant is just an extra special kind of open pollinated plant. So these are special and they're usually passed down through generations because of their valuable characteristics, which might be taste or color or hardiness. Heirlooms usually have a really long history and are pretty good for seed saving. A hybrid plant is usually produced by humans and it is a specific cross between two parents. So I say usually produced by humans because sometimes this can happen in nature, but the ones that you buy in the stores, the seeds, usually are commercially available and will be labeled either hybrid or F1, for example. So hybrid seeds, there's less genetic diversity, and the seeds from these plants usually don't look like the plant that you grew. So they're usually bad for seed saving, and you will need to buy new seeds every year. Hybrid plants might also have patents, so it's important to know. That if you're considering saving seeds from them, which I usually don't recommend to people. So annual plants, these are plants that complete their life cycle in one growing season and are the easiest plants to save seeds from because you can collect seeds that same year. You plant them in the spring, they grow, they flower and set seed, and sometime in the summer or fall, the plant dies and you can harvest the seeds. So this includes flowers and vegetables, so like zinnias, sunflowers, tomatoes, and peas, which are some of the most popular plants to save seeds from. Biennial plants, on the other hand, these plants need to grow for 2 years before you can collect the seeds. So plants start as seed, they grow, and then they go dormant for the winter. The next year, when they continue to grow, this is when they'll send up their flower stalk, they'll set seed, and then they'll die. So these plants can be a little tricky to save seeds from, only because they need to be kept in the ground for 2 seasons or so, or 2 seasons, so they can flower and set seed so you can collect them. So a lot of vegetables that we grow and harvest in the first year are actually biennial plants. So this includes beets, kale, and chard. If you left them in your garden accidentally, you might notice the next year that they will flower and set seed. Perennial plants set seed every year, so they can be easy to save seeds from. So they grow for 3 or more growing seasons, and they grow, they flower, they set seed, and then they go dormant each year. So our native flowers like milkweed and columbine, these are perennial plants, as well as some vegetables like asparagus that I talked about earlier. So as we're looking at this slide, we're primarily concerned with the bolded part of perennial plants' life cycles. We're not really with perennials because they grow and go dormant each year. We're not really talking about like the death or starting them from seed part until later. So when you're selecting plants that you want to save seeds from, be sure to choose open pollinated varieties, which will have the most stable traits. So the plant that you grow from the seeds of an open pollinated variety will be really, really similar to the plant that you collected the seeds from. So one of the major misconceptions of seed saving is that plants in the same family can cross-pollinate with each other. So like cucumbers and squash, which are both in the Cucurbitaceae family. So I've also heard tales of people talking about watermelon and cucumbers crossing and how that can change the flavor of your fruit. So you shouldn't plant them too close to each other. But I assure you that these stories are false. Cucumbers and squash and cucumbers and watermelons are different species, so they won't cross-pollinate. So these stories, they're kind of old wives' tales, but they do teach us an important lesson about seed saving and brings us to the next topic we're going to talk about, which is isolation. So you do need to watch out for cross-pollination between different varieties of the same species, like summer squash and pumpkins, for example. So these plants are different varieties, but they're actually the same species, so they need to be isolated from each other if you're saving seeds. So summer squash, pumpkins, and gourds are all Cucurbita pepo, different varieties of that species, and they can actually cross-pollinate with each other, but plants in the same families rarely do. So these plants are important that if you're growing multiple varieties in your garden and you do want to save seeds, that you're isolating your varieties. And you can do that by planning your garden and planning the amount of space between your different varieties, or by staggering your plantings, for example. So there are three main ways to isolate varieties. You can isolate them by distance, time, and containment. So again, why do you isolate varieties? You isolate them because you want to save the seeds and you want to prevent that unwanted cross-pollination. So we're primarily concerned here with isolation about the seed quality. So you're not going to notice a difference in the fruits, but if you grew the seeds out the next year without isolating them, then you might notice the difference. So the isolation actually will keep them true to type and between the different varieties. So like I said, the three main ways to isolate varieties are distance, time, and containment. So for distance, you will really want to refer to your handout from the Seed Savers Exchange, which includes a lot of that distance information, but I have a few general rules of thumb here presented on the slide. So in general, for self-pollinating plants like tomatoes, they Seed Savers suggest separating varieties by just a few rows. So even though these are self-pollinating plants, there's a small percentage of, because you have, pollinators moving from variety to variety, that there is a chance that they might cross-pollinate if they're planted too closely together. But just a few rows between varieties is plenty for these self-pollinated plants. For primarily self-pollinated plants like oats, you're going to need 5 to 10 feet. Other plants that might be primarily insect pollinated might need 200 yards or more. So this is beans, barley, broccoli, and for wind pollinated plants, these might need to be isolated by a mile or more if they're wind pollinated. Obviously, some of those distances are more feasible and doable than other distances. If you are planting many different varieties of chard, for example, and you're keeping them in the ground for 2 years, separating and isolating them by a mile might not be feasible for you, but you might consider one of these other pollination isolation methods, for example. And for some of these other insect pollinated plants, if you own a home or if you have a larger space to garden, sometimes you can often, if you're planting one variety in the front versus one variety in the back that you want to save your seeds from, that can often be good enough. So that was distance. Next is planting time. So you can also stagger the planting times of your different varieties so they aren't flowering at the same time. That way you can ensure that pollination is only happening and fertilization is only happening between the variety that you want to save seeds from. You can also just consider growing one variety and trying to swap seeds with other people at the end of the season. And then lastly, we have physical barriers, the last isolation method. So some physical barriers like paper bags or floating row covers. You can use a paper bag to cover the wind pollinated flowers like corn, for example, or floating row covers or nylon bags. Floating row covers and nylon bags work really well for insect pollinated plants. So you can do this on individual flowers whose fruit you plan on saving for seeds, or you can do a whole plant. So you can see in the pictures where one picture has just one flower that's isolated with a nylon bag, and the other one, there's a plant underneath it. So you could also hand pollinate if you're really concerned about about where the pollen is coming from. You could gently brush against the stamen, pick up some of that pollen, and gently brush the female part of the plant to transfer that pollen. Use a Q-tip. You could also break off the pollen producing part, the stamen, and directly rub it onto the female stigma, but you just want to do that really gently. So some of the easiest plants to save seed from are annual self-pollinating crops. These plants produce seed every year and they require little to no isolation. Maybe just planting them in different rows or different, a few feet apart from each other is likely enough to get you good high quality seeds. So many plants like peas, beans, tomatoes, other plants in the Solanaceae family, these are relatively easy to save seed from, and I would recommend, if you're just getting into seed saving, that looking for these annual self-pollinating crops is going to be the best place to get started. As you're planning for seed saving, you want to consider that your plants are easy crops and you're going to have to learn a little bit about your plants, so how they grow and especially how they're pollinated. Open pollinated, again, are the easiest. They do need some isolation between varieties, but this can usually be done, like I said, between different rows or the front of your house versus the back of your house. Self-pollinated plants, these are even easiest. You just need a few plants to get good seeds for plants like tomatoes or peas, for example. So as you're learning your plants, you do need to pay attention to species. So like I mentioned before, cucumbers or excuse me, different, pumpkins and squash, they are different varieties of the same species. And so that's really important to know that those can cross-pollinate with each other. When you're growing your plants, you also want to make sure you grow enough if you're going to be harvesting some for eating and harvesting some from saving seeds. So some plants don't reproduce as well when there aren't as many plants around. So be sure to take a look at that handout that was given to you. It's important to note that also because you can lose some genetic diversity over time if you're doing this across many, many seasons. As you're planning, know how to harvest your plants, and we'll talk about that in a few slides here, and be sure to store your seeds properly. So to know when your seeds are mature is going to be really important as you're planning. So one side note I often get asked about is if saving seeds is quote unquote illegal. So I mentioned that some hybrids and definitely some seeds can be patented. This has been a problem in the past for futures and is a current problem for farmers, excuse me, who might want to save their seeds. This is also important for controlled plants. So plants that have, that you're maybe not even allowed to grow in certain places, definitely would be plants that you could not save seeds from. So it can still be legal to grow some of these patented varieties and save the seeds from them, but often the illegality comes from distribution and, sharing the seeds. So the USDA does have a database of patented seeds in case you are really interested in this topic. So you've planted your plants and now you want to know, it's the end of the season, how am I going to select my seeds? So as you're harvesting, make sure you harvest from the best plants that are free of disease. And you always want to consider your most desirable characteristics, whether it's size, flavor, resistance. And when you're harvesting, it's important to note that you want to always harvest viable seeds that have a mature embryo. So these plants will have the desirable characteristics that you want and also have the mature seeds. Thinking about, what might be desirable versus undesirable, I always say you definitely want to save seeds from a non-diseased plant versus a diseased plant. As you're harvesting, it's important to note about seed maturity. So when you're harvesting your plants to eat, for example, that might not be the correct time for seed saving for harvest. So for example, cucumbers, when we harvest cucumbers to eat or to pickle, the seeds are soft. You can eat them really easily, and it's not, you barely even notice your cucumber seeds. But cucumber seeds, so these are at the eating stage, and they're not ripe. For cucumbers, for example, if you're harvesting seed, you have to wait until the plant matures and the fruit matures. It's usually much larger, yellow, the seeds are hard, and so this is well past the prime eating time. So pictured here is a mature eggplant seed and plant that someone is harvesting seeds from. And so these eggplant seeds, when they're harvesting for seed saving, are hard and difficult to eat, and you would have harvested it much earlier if you were just eating the fruit. Mature seeds are often hard and they're often dark in color too. So what does that mature fruit look like? So when the fruit is ripe and it's ready to eat, some plants, the seeds are ready to be saved too. So for like peppers, melons, tomatoes, the fruit and the seed often ripen at the same time. For pod plants like beans and peas, when the pods and seeds are brown and dry, that's when the fruit and the seeds are mature and you're ready to harvest them for seed saving. For plants, like I mentioned, cucumber and eggplant, when the fruit is yellow and the skin is really tough, it's usually well past the prime for eating. That's when the seeds are ready. So lettuce is a special case. Sometimes the flower heads will look dry and they'll look fluffy. And so for lettuce, you want to leave the flowers and seeds on the plants just to mature. And then squash, you want to wait until there's a hard, dry skin. Leave the fruit on the vine as long as possible to mature. And then you want to harvest the fruit and then cure the plants, cure the fruit. So for 2 to 3 months, store them in the cool, dry place to let the seeds mature. When they're mature, they should be large and firm. So you've harvested your seeds, they've dried on the plant or you've brought them inside to dry, and now you need to clean them too. So for flowers, if you're harvesting seeds, you always want to wait for the petals to fall off and don't deadhead your flowers. You can cut off your flower and let it dry in a paper bag or bring it inside and let it dry on the flower. To clean the seeds, you're going to need to separate them from the chaff. So you might need to thresh or use screens. Sometimes you can put the seed pod in a brown paper bag and shake them to separate the seeds from the fruit or from the pod. You also, if the seeds are hard, like for peas, you might even be able to just crush the pod. And so pictured here are some different size screens. Depending on the size of the seed that you have, you can buy these screens excuse me, at your local hardware store to help you clean your seeds a little bit easier. So for dried seeds like beans, peas, many flowers, and herbs, you want to wait for them to be mature and dry, but you also have to dry them further on a screen or in a single layer in an area that's cool or well ventilated to prevent mold or from growing as you're storing them. So you can cut off the seeds heads just before they're fully dry to prevent the seed loss for those small, light, airy seeds. And you could also dry your seed heads in a paper bag to, again, minimize the amount of loss. So if you've ever tried to, for example, harvest seeds from a milkweed plant, it's much easier to harvest the seeds before that pod has fully opened up and the seeds have flown everywhere rather than waiting until the pod opens up and the seeds are flying around. So that would be an example of a plant that I would cut off the seed head and store them until they matured off the plant. So that's for the dry method, dry seeds. But some plants have wet seeds. So cucumbers and tomatoes, they have fleshy fruits, and the seeds often have these gel casings. And so to harvest and store, you have to scoop out the seeds or crush the fruit, however, and you want to put the seeds in a jar with a small amount of water to ferment them for 2 to 4 days. So you cover them with water and stir it daily. So the viable seeds will actually sink to the bottom after 2 to 4 days, and the pulp and the bad seeds that are lighter will float, and you after 2 to 4 days, you want to pour off the top layer, pour off the water, you know, wash the seeds, and then spread them on a paper towel or fine screen to dry them fully before storage. So this fermentation process just helps break down that gel coating and helps prevent mold or something else from growing as you're storing them. So to store seeds, the key is to store them in a cool and dry place. I often choose paper envelopes, but paper bags in a glass jar for long-term storage might be better. Long-term storage you might also include some sort of absorbent in there. So you can buy packets of the stuff that they put in your shoes when you're buying new shoes. You can buy that online and put that in your jar, for example, and that will help absorb some of the water to prevent and minimize the risk of mold growing. If pests are a problem, you definitely want to choose a pest-proof container and an area for long-term storage. And you always, always, always want to label with the name, variety, and date. So an example is shown to you on the screen here, but I always go for more information rather than less, just because you want to remind yourself, you know, in 3 years, if you're using these seeds, you might forget, why did I save them from this plant in particular? So make notes of why you're saving them, desirable characteristics, and then the scientific name, common name, variety, and when you harvested it and how long it's been in storage. So some problems can occur with seed storing. The problems start with the temperature variations, moisture variations. This can lead to mold or mildew buildup. And as I mentioned, you might use a desiccant to help absorb some of that extra moisture. Insects might be a problem, and if you do live in a place where, you know, maybe animals might be a problem too, you might consider storing your seeds in glass jars rather than paper in your basement. So seed viability can decrease over time. Seeds are alive, they are losing water slowly, and this is why people say that some seeds only last 1 year versus other seeds lasting longer. So in general, parsley, onion, corn, lettuce, these seeds last 1 year. 3 years are seeds from plants like eggplant, spinach, squash, radish, but many of them can last over 5 years, but if they're stored in the correct conditions. And really long-lasting seeds are like your beans, your tomatoes, peas, peppers, pumpkins. And so these are just general rules of thumb based on correct storage procedures. One way to test your seeds before you grow them is a germination test. So to do a germination test, you'll take a random sample of 5 or 25 seeds. I usually go for about 25 seeds. You wet them on a paper towel or coffee filter. You can also just plant them in soil. Make sure you spread the seeds on half of your paper towel and fold it over or roll it so it's like really moist, and keep it in a Ziploc bag or container to keep that moisture up. You then would open the paper towel after 5 or 7 days and count how many show signs of healthy germination. Then you can extrapolate out to your percentage, and that'll give you a good percentage of how many of those seeds are viable that year. So that germination process is good for most seeds, but it's important to remember that some plants actually have a dormancy requirement, so before they can even germinate at all. So native seeds, for example, they often need cold, moist conditions before they germinate. You can reproduce this in your fridge for plants like milkweed or columbine, or you can just plant them directly outside. Some seeds also need light, scarification, or even fire. So it's important to know your plant and know your seed, and be sure to check the requirements of the seed before you're germinating them. So The resources that I gave you today were from Seed Savers Exchange, and there's a lot of other great websites, extension websites that have information on seed saving too. The USDA has a lot of good information, and there's also other educators that have been teaching about seed saving for a long time also. So here's my contact information if you need it. The best way to reach me is via email. The Four Seasons Gardening webinar series is also on YouTube. You can use this short URL, go.illinois.edu/fourseasonsrecordings. And this webinar will be posted in about 4 weeks after it has been closed captioned. So please, if you have time, please take your phone and scan this QR code to take a brief survey. This helps inform our programming later. You can also use this short URL at the bottom here, and I will leave it open to questions. Thank you all very much.